How's it going, everybody? My name is Will from Ghosthack, and today I'm going to teach you a little bit about how to do pre-drop fills for electronic music. Now, if there are any beginners watching that might be a little confused, what I mean by a pre-drop fill is basically the one point right before the drop hits where something interesting happens to kind of cue in the drop of your track. Now, not all EDM tracks have pre-drop fills. Sometimes there's just one pre-drop drum hit. That's very common in house music. You'd have like the Prida snare, like the that everyone knows. But especially in heavier, kind of more bass-oriented styles of EDM, such as dubstep, pre-drop fills are extremely common. You can find them in almost every track. And I'm going to use dubstep as kind of an example genre today. Now, if you don't make dubstep, that's perfectly fine. These things that I'm going to show you are definitely applicable to other electronic genres as well. But I made a video recently where I was showing how you can fill out an electronic drop. I kind of used dubstep as an example about the kind of layers you can add to a drop to fill it out and make it sound more full and powerful and rich. And I thought I would use that project file, create a small little buildup, have a blank space for a pre-drop fill, and then I could throw some things in and show you what I would do to fill in that space before the drop. This is what it sounds like right now. Now, the basses in the drop itself were just designed after some Ghosthack bass loops that I chopped up a little bit just to create an example drop. So it's not necessarily the perfect, best drop that I've ever made in my life, but there's an empty space there and it needs filling up with something. As you can hear, it doesn't sound good when it's just... So we have to throw some stuff in there. So that's what I'm going to go over today. So when it comes to filling this blank space right here, there are a few categories of things that I usually have. Now, obviously, what you use in your fill could sound good or it could sound bad, depending on what kind of track you're making. A lot of tracks, let's say, like if you have a really creepy track, what I'm saying, that's meant to be dark and creepy and ominous, then you could have very little stuff in your fill. It would just go completely silent and it might have one vocal. And then it would go into a heavy drop, like you'd hear that a lot in Dubstep. There's no escape. Or sometimes if you're making something that's a lot more energetic and you don't want to stop that energy, then you'll have a lot of things happening in the fill and, it'll sound really big. But the elements that I'm going to use in this fill are the elements that I see myself using by far the most when I create fills, pretty much no matter what track I'm making. Not all tracks will contain these elements in their pre-drops, but it's something that is reoccurring amongst all my tracks. So I'm going to use this opportunity to go over pretty much all of them. Now, the first thing that a lot of people probably see coming is a pre-drop vocal. And the pre-drop vocal that I'm going to use in this little bit is going to be a pre-drop vocal that I found in Ghosthack's Ultimate Vocal Shots library. This pack was made by yours truly, and it contains this vocal right here, which is my processed vocal. Check this. And I actually really like this one to use for drops, especially for dubstep. And what I did was I put it on this part right here. I just put it right here. Check this. So it's right on beat. It's 140. I made sure to kind of stretch it out and make sure that it's on tempo with 150. You can see that the time is kind of changed here. And just to lead up into that vocal, to make sure that the listener isn't really caught off guard by it, I added these things. I added just a little bit of the beginning of the word check. Just the ch, that little consonant right there. Check this. I've also done that before on one of my tracks with a vocal that says drop it. It went drop it. And it works really well when you do that sort of thing, just to kind of glitch into the vocal. Now, not everyone does this. Obviously, that's just something that I really like to do, but I think it really works well for transitioning through the pre-drop. And already, if we give this a listen. Check this. It doesn't not work. Like, that could be sufficient for a lot of different styles of music, just adding that little vocal. But of course, I'm not going to just add the vocal. I want to add other things on top of it to make this one a little more filled out, because a lot of these pre-drops don't even contain a vocal. They might contain other elements. And one of those other very important elements would be drums, like you would use in a drum fill. Again, this is kind of a pre-drop fill to fill out this area. So using something like a drum fill or a drum break is extremely common. common. I've done it in my own music as well. This fill right here is from Dubstep Sound Arsenal, and it sounds like this. It's like a weird, chopped up, processed fill that sounds like a mix of electronic and acoustic at the same time. It's kind of interesting. It's almost like an amen break. And a lot of times fills like these could be used in place of vocals. Like you wouldn't necessarily need much else other than this fill. Like stuff like that definitely works, but I find it pretty interesting when you layer the fill with vocals. So what I did was I have this fill happening right at the beginning, and then I kind of layered it just where I thought it was strategic. I kind of chopped it up a little bit and put it where I wanted it, and then I mixed it with the chops for this vocal, the check this chops. And so we have a little bit of the drums, and then it cuts out to just make way for the vocal, and then it will go into the drop. Check this. And having those little transitions between elements in the fills is also a pretty cool idea if you want to keep up the energy, so it's not necessarily just the same thing for these 4 beats. So probably the 2 most common things that I hear in pre-drops are vocals and drum fills. Those are, like, I find those in tons of different genres of music. Any genre of music that has pre-drops tends to use those as kind of a go-to. That's really a good go-to for pre-drops. But that's not necessarily the end of the story. There are other elements to this that I like to add as well, and I kind of want to go over them. The first one is going to be a pre-kick. Now, usually I use sounds like these before snares. You know, you might have a little swish right before a snare, so the snare might hit harder. It could turn a snare like this into a snare like this. And that snare with the little right before it, it seems to have just a lot more power. It's like something's actually swinging down to hit the snare. It has sort of an impact feeling. And that is actually very important. It's just a little minor detail, but those things can be very, very helpful. And what I want to do through this is just to add a little bit of that to the kick. I want to add a pre-kick, so it sounds like something's actually coming down and impacting. And the sound I have for this pre-kick is this. This is actually a kick 2 from the Dubstep Sound Arsenal that I reversed, and I took out some of the bass. I also kind of trimmed the head so it wasn't super impactful, but basically it just slides into the kick. Like that. Here I was like, whoosh, like it sounds like it's actually coming down and impacting. And you can listen to this fill without it. Check this. And now listen to it with it. Check this. It's subtle. It's not necessarily something you notice at first, and maybe I could even turn it up a little louder if I wanted to. You can really, controlling the volume of that is a very, it's a very important part of this, because if it's too loud, it'll sound kind of weird. If it's too quiet, then of course it's not going to do anything. So getting it at the right level is important, but it can add a lot of energy just to the first hit of your drop. So that's something I definitely recommend doing in your fills if you want your drop to really smack and hit hard. And the last element here could kind of be several different elements. You know, this all depends on how big and how thick and how rich you want your fill to be. Sometimes you want your fills to be super big and thick and heavy, and sometimes you want them to be a little more minimal with not so much ambience. Maybe they don't need to be that heavy, but I like to add some kind of sound effect, whether that be an impact or a down sweeper or some kind of ambient sound effect to be in the background. For these purposes, I picked out this impact right here, which is not a particularly complicated impact. This is just an impact from, once again, Dubstep Sound Arsenal from Ghosthack. And all I did was have this impact hit on the first hit, right? And then just the ambience of the impact just continues on and kind of fades out throughout this fill. So it makes it sound a little less dry and a little more lively, because we have a pretty lively buildup here. Even though I kind of threw together this buildup, there's a lot of energy in here. Check this. And then we go into a fill that's very, very dry. And sometimes that works out pretty well, but I wanted to add the impact just to make sure the transition from the buildup to the fill wasn't super weird. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't just a super harsh, big, wide, energetic, really small, tighten up front. I wanted something to kind of fill it out a little bit, and the impact worked out pretty well. And an impact, for me, tends to work out pretty well, especially if I'm using a drum loop, I've found. Check this. So So those are the main elements that I would use in my pre-drop fills, especially for a style such as dubstep. Just to recap, I have vocal right here. I have a pre-drop vocal that I chopped up and glitched out. Check this. I have a little drum loop that I also chopped up. I have this little pre-kick kind of sliding into the kick to give the kick more impact. And then I also just have a straight up impact to give it more ambience and a little more air and width. And before I end the video, just one more last listen in context. Check this. So there you have it. There is my little lesson on pre-drop fills for electronic music. I hope you found this helpful. Hopefully there's some bits and pieces in here that either you recognize from other tracks that you've heard before, or maybe you've used this in tracks already yourself. If you haven't, then definitely go in and utilize these. Sometimes I use this as kind of a checklist when I have a blank space before my drop. Think about what elements of these that I have right here could be used and would sound good. You know, do I want it to be a kind of a silent pre-drop? Maybe I want not much happening and just a little bit happening, because maybe the drop that I'm going into is more minimal and it's not super energetic. Maybe it's meant to be a little quieter, so I don't want the fill to overshadow the drop, of course. Or maybe the drop is really crazy heavy and I want to continue the energy through that fill. And of course, I'm not saying that you have to stick to these rules either. I think some of the more interesting pre-drops that I've heard are the ones that might not stick to these rules. Maybe they want to do their own thing. Maybe it's a whole different, they take a whole different approach to a pre-drop. So not trying to limit anybody's creativity out here, just giving some basic pointers to some people who want to know some, rock solid ways of making decent pre-drops. So thank you all so much for watching. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next video. Happy producing.